so that you can decide if they're safe or not first? Or would you rather give us the information and then we'll make our own decision? It's a slightly different question. And the answer I got when I asked that question to a lot of Japanese citizens when I was in Japan was, we don't want to make the decision. We would like the government to just make the decision for us, because that way it's not our responsibility to make this choice. And so I think it's just a difference in terms of the relationship that people have with the government. So the government in Japan has potentially more power to implement policies, but if those policies fail, there is a much greater level of responsibility attributed to the government, and the government is supposed to fix the problem. And that also leads to a general, maybe a lower, an even level of support for the bureaucracy, and potentially for the Diet as well, but for the bureaucracy, until a crisis happens. And then everyone takes a step back and tries to figure out, what did you do wrong that we didn't know about? Something had to be wrong, because otherwise, we wouldn't be having this problem. And then the last relationship that plays into the government-public relationship is this government-media relationship. And I think probably there's been some in the press that's about this as well, but planned leaks of policies to inform the public opinion polls, these issues, these types of mechanisms are used to inform the public and also to maintain relationships between these different groups. And some are perceiving that actually the role of the media in a crisis is different now. And I think my colleague's going to talk a lot more about media relationships, but my little bit I was going to say is it seems like there's more now of an opportunity for the media to actually be assertive and to question things, and that seems like it's been happening. Whether it happened too much, I don't know. Okay, so next slide, please. So the final area I wanted to look at is risk perceptions, and I sort of see it as 4 spheres. So there's a sphere of risk perceptions within the Japanese government broadly, within the Japanese public, within the media, and then the foreign or international organizations, foreign governments, and then international organizations are kind of the 4th sphere. And within the government, because of this sensitivity to public perceptions, there's this view that transparency is bad, because the public is waiting for the government to do something wrong, or waiting for the government to do everything right. So they're very hesitant to release information until they're sure that it's going to be information that they should be giving the public. And that obviously became a problem in this particular case, because there was information coming out faster than the government could control it sometimes. And sometimes they were releasing information early because they thought they needed to, and then they would pull it back. But by that point, it was too late, so it looked like they were lying. And it created all sorts of problems, because the typical situation with risk perceptions is that the government can figure out what they would like to release and then do it. But when you have a disaster like March 11th, they weren't operating the way they normally operate in terms of the release of information and where the information was coming from. And then, so the public view that plays into this of risks is pretty much zero tolerance. We should not have to deal with any risk. And obviously when you define risk, there are different types of risks, but in terms of a risk of a power plant, for instance, or damage from the earthquake and the tsunami, they would like to see 0. And then the media, in this case, chose to examine risk, but I think that's pretty indicative of the way the media handles crises in general. They may not question the risks of different technologies or different policies until there's a crisis, and then the media will step in and start to question and compare different levels of risk. So the reason that I have foreign governments and international organizations there is twofold. One is, in this particular case, the United States actually ended up playing a role in the perceptions of risk regarding the aftermath of the tsunami and the earthquake and the nuclear reactor problems, because many of you probably already know this story, and some of you here are probably in the US government, but the embassy in Tokyo had defined a certain evacuation zone following the problems with Fukushima Daiichi, and the Japanese government had also defined a certain zone, and they were not the same. So it appeared that the US government was superseding the Japanese decision and was widening the zone, which then made everyone question the Japanese government's view of risk. And so it's not the case, I think, that foreign governments always play a role in risk perceptions in Japan, but I think in a time of crisis like this, they do. and especially because it was a foreign government that was located in Tokyo that was making that decision, and it appeared, then everyone started to question who was right. It does play a role. And then the second reason that I bring it up is because currently the IAEA and the IEA are both being directed by Japanese officials, and because the IAEA was playing a role in risk perceptions as well and defining what the risks were for radiation levels and evacuation, it put Japan and the East Japanese officials in particular in an unusual position, because these officials who were heads of international organizations had to make a judgment about Japan, and if they felt that the Japanese government was not doing the right thing, they had to be careful about how they said that, and if they were doing the right thing, they had to be careful about how they said that, because then otherwise it would look like they were just supporting their own government. So I thought it was just a unique confluence of circumstances that you had two energy-related organizations run by Japanese that were international, that were being viewed as objective, that were having to make decisions about what was happening in Japan. So what does this mean for the actual energy policy process? You have the Basic Energy Plan, which was implemented in 2003, and it was actually one of the few laws at that time that was not written by the bureaucracy. It was written by the Diet, and one Diet member in particular, who is a former executive vice president of TEPCO. And it kind of goes back to reflect this whole concept of we need to protect nuclear power, because it underlies our energy security and our environmental protection. In 2010, the policy was revised, and the 3 E's were retained, but they added 2 more E's. And one is energy-based economic growth. And again, protecting nuclear power, but still encouraging the concept of economic growth. And then energy industry reform, which is not deregulation. Energy industry reform was actually more of a consolidation of industries to support this concept of a low-carbon economy. So the discussion was about, and this is from Medi, the conversation was more about how to bring home electronics, alternative fuel vehicles, and the utilities all into one arena. And I think probably they were looking at smart grid as they did this. So it's not, they're calling it, I think they actually even called it structural reform, but it was not the kind of structural reform that was ongoing in the early 2000s. All right, so we've discussed a little bit about the relationships already. I just wanted to discuss them in the specific related to energy policy process. You have MEDI-MX, and I actually didn't put the cabinet office in it, but there's some tension there. And then you have MEDI-MX bureaucracy versus the Diet, and then you have the government versus federal government versus local government, and then you have the entire government, the relationship with the private sector, relationship with the public, and relationship with the media. And I think that the main issues I didn't mention that I wanted to highlight about these are the overlapping regulation within the government is what came to the forefront. So you had a regulatory agency under MEDI, a regulatory agency under NEXT, and a regulatory agency under the Prime Minister's office, all of which were supposed to be regulating the nuclear power plants, but in different capacities. So the jurisdiction was overlapping, but still not independent. And then when you come to the central versus local government relationship, you have jobs and energy security on one side, and then you have the risk issues kind of balancing on the other, and safety issues balancing on the other side. So after the accidents that occurred in the 1990s, there was local opposition to power plant expansion, but for the most part, broadly, the plans for expansion overcame that, and they were still continuing, and actually safer plants were being built because it was by that point the 2nd or 3rd generation of reactors. So explaining that to the public became an issue because people were looking at old technologies versus new technologies, and not. Ishiwatari's sensei was talking about the technology issue, but if you're comparing old and new technologies and you're kind of lumping them all as one nuclear technology that people are afraid of because there were accidents, it's different than having accounted for those problems and incorporating those into the next generation of reactor. So in terms of the energy process and risk perceptions, energy security became the primary issue people thought of when they thought of risk. They didn't really think about safety, even though we had accidents that people were thinking about in the short term. The broad view was the risk is minimize energy insecurity, promote energy independence, prevent energy supply problems. And so nuclear power remains prominent there. And the thought of investing in other technologies, other clean technologies, but also new nuclear technologies was difficult for the utilities, and has been, because there was such a high startup cost for the old technologies that the thought of upgrading or changing what plans might have been for new plants became difficult. And I think that Japan has been incorporating the newer technologies into their expansion plans, but they weren't shutting down the old reactors. They were leaving, including Fukushima, Daiichi, they were leaving the old reactors operating, primarily because energy security is the top risk concern that everybody is thinking about. Okay, so this brings us to March 11th. And you have the 3 E's with the other 2 E's that are kind of lumped in there on one side of the scale, and you have public safety on the other. And that is not to say the Japanese government is not concerned about public safety or didn't have some countermeasures for public safety incorporated. Ishiwatari Sensei actually mentioned a number of the safety features, but it was never included as part of this overall energy policy view that you needed to count this as a pillar. And I think if it had, they probably would have had to have plans to shut down these other reactors sooner, or at least have some way of incorporating mechanisms that might have prevented some problems. So then when we come to the relationships, oh, actually, I'm sorry, go back for one second. We'll say one more thing about this. So when it comes to, so that was the vulnerabilities. That was the set of vulnerabilities that were revealed, is this prioritization of the 3 E's and not so much an emphasis on safety. So in terms of countermeasures, you need to think about, the Japanese government needs to think about how to rebalance the 3 E's and add public safety, incorporate public safety into that element. And one example I was just going to offer of that is they have passive safety systems. I think this has been covered in the press too, probably, but passive safety systems that include water that surrounds the core, and it automatically will enter the core if there's a problem, so no one has to push a button or tell it what to do. That is not how the old generation of reactors operates. These are all newer generations of reactors that include these passive safety systems. And the US government actually is looking at our policy and the way our policy and governance structure has contributed to the nuclear program here. We actually have very similar situations. So all of this is about Japan, but the US is really not that different. So everything I'm saying could actually probably take Japan out and put US in terms of the way our nuclear program has developed, and the need for the passive safety systems, and potentially even the balancing of that and economic growth in our case is probably next to the energy security instead of under it. Sorry about that. So if you look at the different relationships, the vulnerabilities that were revealed were the way the relationships have been structured kind of contributed to this formation of an energy policy process that left Japan with few options if their nuclear system was compromised. And what ended up happening is that everyone was blaming everyone else. The government was blaming other elements within the government. The government was also blaming the private sector. The private sector was blaming the government. The public didn't know. I mean, the public is listening to everybody, so now they think there's a problem with the government and a problem with the private sector. And then the media contributed to these disintegrations. And so what ends up happening is that you have a bunch of relationships that were working around an energy policy process, and they've all disintegrated. And they left just the Japanese flag. Everybody's still under the Japanese flag, but they're not. but they're not connected anymore because everybody's blaming everybody else. So it's making it very difficult for all of these different diverse groups to work together. So countermeasures.